first day of every month, thousands of people flock to this ordinary house in Mexico City to take part in a bizarre ritual to visit the altar of a saint. But this is no ordinary saint. She is Santa Muerte, Saint Death.
Hello and welcome once again, everybody, to another episode of the Puffs with Peter podcast. I am your host, Anthony Schneider, and unfortunately, I have a bit of a cold tonight, so if I sound congested, well, that's because I am. But I was not about to let a mere cold stop me from doing this episode with tonight's very special guest. For those not blessed to know our guest tonight, he's a writer, a scholar, a podcaster, a man not afraid to discuss the topics others are too scared to touch. He's a man with a fashion all his own, the one, the only, Thomas777. Thomas, thank you so much for coming on TradTards. I have really been looking forward to this day for quite some time.
You're welcome. Thanks for hosting me, and thanks for that very kind introduction.
Well, of course, had the pleasure of meeting you, and I can attest that, you're as professional as you present yourself on all of your appearances. It's great to meet your heroes, and you're not disappointed.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, man. And yeah, I've had people say to me that I'm a lot more chill and like a nicer guy than they thought I'd be. It's like, well, what did you think, man? Like, I hope I don't present myself like a dick or something. I think so many people, I don't know, man. I speculate because so many people curate sort of an image or something for their brand, which is totally fine. I mean, I'm not begrudging the way people do things. I think some people don't realize that the way I live my life is pretty much the same as what you see in my content, and that kind of trips them out. But yeah, it's funny.
Yeah, well, before I had met you, I knew who you were, but I actually I'd seen you just more of your appearances on other shows, and I hadn't taken the time to read a lot of your work that you had put out. Just over the past week, I was reading a little bit. I've been unfortunately very busy. A little bit of Seal Storm, one of your works, and I'm really intrigued. I'm going to finish the entirety of the first book, and as someone who also has dabbled a little bit in writing, it has a very good hook, I'll say. So I'm excited to continue that.
No, it's great, man. Thank you.
Yeah, and speaking of your other appearances, you of course have done a lot of work with a good friend of the channel here, Mr. Burden, Jay Burden, and I was listening to your episode where you and him were discussing, matters of the occult, speaking about, some of these more like esoteric levels to, like serial killer violence and a lot of the interesting kind of like cultural milieu of the 70s and the 80s and into the 90s. A really, really great series of episodes. And I thought as part of that, you had mentioned, but didn't really explore the Santa Muerte cult, which for my channel, I thought, man, if I could have Thomas on and talk about this, this is a channel that is mostly frequented by traditional Catholics, but what better crossroads than to speak about Santa Muerte with it having obviously a Catholic cultural influence, also tying a lot into Latin American history, which obviously has a lot to do with Catholicism, and then having someone of your expertise and knowledge just kind of in this general area, among many other things, of course, I couldn't pass up the opportunity. So Santa Muerte, it's pretty wild if I guess people aren't aware of it. Did you kind of want to maybe give a little bit of a summary of at least how you've come to like view it, or
yeah, and to be clear, I'm not an expert on the subject matter, of Santa Muerte. But what I will say is this: the way I kind of came to knowledge of it, I was deep diving a lot into the phenomena of serial killers and things. You know, not from like a murderabilia or fanboy perspective, because that's corny. But you know, I've got a similar interest to the subject matter that the late Dave McGowan did. I don't agree with his thesis, but there was something in the culture that was producing these people, and it was a real phenomena when I was a kid and a young person, and it was quite frightening. And in particular, you know, my folks are from Los Angeles. You know, I don't have deep roots in Chicago. I mean, this is definitely my hometown, but you know, I spent a lot of my early life in Los Angeles, and when I was a kid, I was staying out in LA when Richard Ramirez was on his rampage, you know, the Night Stalker.
Yep.
And that really stuck in my mind because it was really frightening. And then, you know, when Ramirez got arrested, you know, like I was saying on the show with Burton, in my mind, I thought of the Night Stalker as being this kind of like hulking, monstrous guy. I almost imagined him like, you know, like the bad guy in the movie Cobra or something. But then, as it turns out, he was this kind of sinister, like skinny guy who like looked very demonic, and that was this whole thing. He was a Satanist. But you know, so as I got older, I started reading about Ramirez, and I read a lot of what Nicholas Schreck wrote about him because he knew him and he interviewed him over years. You know, and Ramirez was very proud of his Mexican heritage, and he very much was into the old gods and stuff. And Ramirez's Satanism, I came to realize it was more this kind of atavistic pagan sensibility. And I'm not trashing Spanish people or something, or saying that their experience of the divine is somehow intrinsically evil or something. But I think there is a susceptibility to people of certain racial lineages to being captivated by these atavistic sensibilities. And Ramirez was very clear, especially when he got heavily addicted to drugs. He started having what he considered to be visionary experiences, telling him, you know, and he felt that he was possessed by forces, metaphysical forces, commanding him to quite literally make blood sacrifices and things. You know, and I started thinking about that. And, you know, then much later here in Chicago, you know, there's a lot of Spanish people here, you know, and in particular, a lot of Mexican people. I mean, we've got quite a few Puerto Rican people too, and other ethnicities, but in particular, there's a very prominent Mexican community. And some years back, in kind of the heart of Mexican Chicago, I came across this tag on a wall abutting an alleyway of Santa Muerte, and it was very sinister, man. I mean, I'm kind of interested in gangster graffiti anyway, and in Chicago, it very much has its own aesthetical motifs and stuff. You know, Chicago gangsterdom is its own thing. It's different than on the coast or other places, and it goes very, very deep. But there is a very sinister energy to this tag. And, you know, it's not just something that these guys would invoke to intimidate people. They really believe in it. You know, they believe that there really is like a conscious instantation of death itself that is a being. And that it reaps souls and people who serve it gain worldly power, you know, and that's why apparently a lot of these narco types, you know, they view Santa Muerte almost as their patron saint, and that's as as a lot of people from the Southwest and a lot of people who come over the border legally and illegally, they end up in Chicago for various reasons, including the fact that, you know, there's a substantial Mexican community and Spanish-speaking community here. You can kind of get lost in or hide in, and a lot of these peoples that got familiar relations and things who are located here, but you know, it's become more prominent, like that kind of stuff, as some of these people from border country come here and they bring that sensibility with them. So it seems that a lot of these gangbangers who have got connections to cartel shit, they've sort of taken on those sensibilities. And you know, like I said, this is obviously a very sinister iteration, and I'm a Calvinist. I'm a Reformed Presbyterian, so I don't want people to think I'm saying mean things about Roman Catholics, because I'm not. And I think very highly of the Roman Catholic faith. But there is a pagan atavistic strain to Latin American Catholicism, and that it can veer into some pretty dangerous areas. You know, when some people don't realize that, I don't think. And some of these parishioners, I think they don't even realize that they're being captured by demonic influences, you know, because these things are familiar in their culture and stuff. So they view it benignly when they probably shouldn't view it that way. I mean, that's the short answer to how I became interested in the subject matter.
No, that's really powerful. I'll say this. No, I completely see kind of what you're talking about, just in regards to the Latin American culture and specifically the culture around Catholicism in Mexico. And you see this, you know, somewhat as well, even reflected back, like, you know, just in Spain proper, you know, going back across the pond. Um, there is like when you're in a culture that is just so steeped already in a singular faith, you know, you hear a lot about, you know, cultural Christianity and, you know, Catholic context. A lot of people call it cultural Catholicism, kind of like, you know, taking for granted that there's this cultural baseline of Catholicism. And so the motifs and the images and all these things are just kind of part of what forms everyone's kind of mindset around religious imagery. And so it's unfortunate that you see this in a lot of countries now. Some of the most traditionally Catholic and just, you know, traditionally Christian countries, you see, you know, a massive gap in actual practice, right? People might just be in the church, and that's, you know, they might get married in it, baptize their kids, you know, show up on Easter, show up on Christmas, you know, big whoop. It's just kind of it's a cultural touch point for them. And as you mentioned, right, with Chicago being kind of a crossroads for a lot of immigrants coming in, and not, I know not just for Hispanics too. There's a lot of different, especially I had a lot of friends there from Eastern Europe, and
Oh no,
yeah,
we're one of the few big cities. We get a lot of white immigration here, you know, which is
yeah.
good. But I mean, it's unusual. Yeah, it's really like a crossroad. It's literally the center of the United States, so
Yep.
it's kind of a crossroad. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I think some groups also like the colder climes of Chicago as well, which that makes it very interesting. But yeah, going back to those cultural touch points that I think kind of set the stage for why Santa Muerte kind of took off. Uh, when it comes to a female religious figure in Hispanic culture, what more well-known image is there than the Virgin of Guadalupe, right? Like Guadalupana. I think everyone, Catholic or not, like has seen this image somewhere if you've been anywhere with any sort of Hispanic population. And, you know, the most obvious way to look at this is that, well, even I've heard this said before by anthropologists, like 90% of Mexico is Catholic, and maybe a certain percentage of that 90% actually like fully believes and is practicing, but 100% of Mexicans believe in the Guadalupana. That image of the Virgin Mary, you know, the whole story about how that really is what led to the mass conversions of a lot of the indigenous during, you know, the times of the Spanish colonies, uh, is just ubiquitous and just a huge cultural touchstone for them. And then looking at Santa Muerte, it's almost like a Manichaean like opposite. You have this personification of death, which isn't even a person, right? Death doesn't bear any fruit. Meanwhile, the fruit of the virgin is obviously Christ. So I can see why, like, there already is that priming in potentially, someone that's really steeped in that culture. And I think also too, now we're seeing a little bit of it becoming more endemic in like second generation, like immigrant families. Apparently, from some sources I've read, we've even had like non-Hispanics starting to look towards this. And because it offers, as you mentioned, it's definitely outside of the correct cult, like Catholic, hagiography of saints. It's definitely not an approved saint. Catholics don't worship death as a personification. Death is just, a consequence of sin. But someone that is steeped in that culture of Catholicism, where they have ideas about how they venerate, how they worship, ideas about ritual and liturgy, and then how they transpose that to something that's outside of that Catholic context, so they're not bound by the church. Uh, as you mentioned with the Night Stalker, and where there's like a ritualistic aspect to it, uh, it is like a perversion of, obviously in the Catholic faith and other Christian sects, there's a big emphasis on the ritual of worship, the liturgy as it stands. I know that not just with Ramirez, but there's been other cases that where Santa Muerte does have direct ties, or there was a Santa Muerte image where someone's been killed in a ritualistic fashion. Uh, there's a lot to unpack there in regards to how the cultural Catholicism of Latin America primes people for looking for an option outside the church when they're engaging in activities that they couldn't necessarily go and have a priest, help them out with that, or even like feel probably morally correct praying to a regular saint from their childhood. Um, I don't know. Do you think that this is all kind of a way for people to feel that they feel like they're at home because it's like similar to what they know, but they don't want to kind of go back towards that traditional structure of religion as they would view it?
The problem is the reason why religion is dangerous, and the reason, I mean, that's the reason why political authorities are constantly trying to suppress and or manipulate or appropriate it. That's the reason why there's these vicious sectarian conflicts, because there's tremendous power in religious belief, but also, I mean, the reason why one of the key one of the key stories in scripture is that of Abraham and Isaac, and Yahweh commanding that the practice of sacrifice end. Okay, because human sacrifice is universal to human societies. It literally is, and there's evidence of it going back 40,000 years. It's been going on since humans became humans, in anatomical and behavioral ways. Why is that? Well, I mean, I have my own thoughts on this. I've suggested it probably quite literally owes to ancestral memory of when humans were quite literally preyed upon by carnivorous beasts of the field like saber-toothed tigers, or by not quite human hominids who were cannibals. And sometimes when a hungry predator appeared at the mouth of the cave, if an infant was left for it to take and consume, sometimes it would go away sated and let the rest of the tribe live. Sometimes it wouldn't. But obviously, stuff like that would take on a sacral significance, and the human experience, before humans became truly sapient, the earliest human experience of God, as they perceived it, was these powerful elemental forces in nature. particularly predatory elements in things. And the ability to bargain with or control those things through sacrificial practices became paramount. It's literally coded into human beings to respond to that, the ritual bloodletting and things. So if this isn't controlled, it can reemerge in earnest, and that's horrifying. And if people think that it can't reemerge among, like civilized white or Japanese people or something, they're wrong, because it can, and it does. And that's one of the reasons I think people take it too far in my own faith tradition. But that's one of the reasons why a lot of Calvinists get so upset about the practice of maintaining relics and things. Say, it's the worship of human remains, and that's a slippery slope, and it's not just idolatrous in their mind, it's something way more sinister. Like I didn't know this beforehand, but some years back, like a friend of mine was this Iranian lady out in Baltimore, and there's a lot of occulted Christians among the Shia. I mean, there's Alawites who are probably actually Orthodox, but there's a lot of other people who superficially practice Shia Islam, but are basically occulted Christians or Christian heretics. Like they're into like Neoplatonist kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And she was talking about how the Islamic authorities, it's a big deal to them if they think you're housing human remains as relics. That's a big crime. That makes them really upset. And she was talking about how, like in her tradition, there was a practice of keeping reliquaries and stuff, and this had to be hidden. But I'm not suggesting that the practice of keeping relics or housing them in a reliquary is anything like human sacrifice at all. Okay. But my point is, the reason why there's this sort of puritanical over response to regulating those things is there's this sort of hard-coded fear that any indication of ascribing a sacral significance to mortal remains for any reason is partaking of something, that has the potential to be appropriated by demonic influences. And that's where it comes from. Okay, so, there's this constant struggle within every culture, this interfaith tension between paganism and Christianity, which is, which is logos. One of the reasons I like the film The Wicker Man, the original, with Edward Woodward and I can't remember his name, Christopher Lee, but that's what the whole film's about.
It's classic.
Yeah, and it's a serious movie. It's not just, like a fun horror movie or whatever. It's about a serious subject matter, and in England especially, that's very much felt. There is a deep pagan strain in England especially. I'd argue even more so than in Ireland, Ulster, or Scotland. Wales, I don't know enough about the Welsh culture to speak on that, but this is a very real thing. And like I said, I'm careful in how I talk about it because I am reformed. I don't want people to think that I'm being a bigot or something towards our Orthodox and Catholic friends, because I'm not. What I'm dispassionately explaining why this is an issue between that takes on a sectarian characteristic. But I view the Santa Muerte thing, in that vein, and it's not for me to criticize the Vatican. But I will say this: if there's not a pope who exhibits a very strong, almost rigid leadership on doctrinal matters, there's a real risk of these kinds of things reemerging. You know, and I'm not the Pope can't be everywhere, and the Pope himself isn't God, obviously. So there's only so much any one man can do, but the Pope's uniquely situated to enforce correct doctrine of worship, and depending on depending on the man who's insinuated into the role, sometimes that's handled better than other times. I'll leave it at that.
I'd say this: a lot of Catholics would agree with you. Believe me, it's the papacy, as you meant. Yeah, it's hard for the Pope to like really take that ministerial role, especially when he oversees every diocese in the world, along with his own in Rome. But just like any other senior leader, if you've been in any organization, the senior leader sets the tone, right? So if the Pope were to come out hard against it and be very clear and very clear cut on doctrinal matters, what we believe, not trying to placate popular sensibilities, then that would have a chain reaction down through to the episcopates and how individual bishops, administer the faithful. Now, I have seen that some of the bishops in Mexico have taken a hardline stance against it. Now, in my limited research on this, it seems that Santa Muerte, the first sources like are very early on in like the late 18th century, like 1790 in Mexico. I believe like in like Chiapas, historically one of the more poorer regions, and I think one other state in what is now the Republic of Mexico in the center.
There's also there's strong native influences in Chiapas too, like
Yeah,
Indio. Yeah, even among people who are even among mestizos and white people. Yeah, go ahead, buddy.
yeah, and they've always had kind of that, even today politically with their kind of unique autonomy they have in that area. Um, they've always kind of had that separation from the rest of Mexican culture, to that extent where they could even have something like this prop up. I understand the Inquisition went in there, closed it down, knocked down a couple shrines, and it wasn't until really post World War II when American anthropology was starting to get a little bit more interested in the indigenous, populations of Mexico and some of that history, that they started to kind of find out that this practice among some still existed, and it was kind of like a hush hush thing. There still was enough like overt pressure from the Catholic Church at large to you definitely didn't want to be known as a practitioner of this. I imagine it's probably similar to like being a practitioner of Santeria or otherwise. Um, and then we see a resurgence in a big way in the 90s. Um, I wanted to know if you thought this too. There seems to be a almost like a pattern where these two times it emerged first in the 1790s and once again kind of in the 1990s, so I guess a 200-year gap. These were kind of times where there was a lot of change going on in these areas. Obviously 1790s is like right before Mexico gains independence from the viceroyalty in New Spain, and in the 1990s is when you start seeing kind of the emergence of some of the problems that have kind of just become systemic now in terms of problems at the border and lots of undocumented movement, illegal movement of people across the frontera, as it were. Uh, it seems like people like to turn to these more, how should I say, you said atavistic, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, atavistic forms of religion, spirituality, when there's like a lot of chaos and crisis, where I guess you have institutions that can't offer what they might see as a stable solution or one that can actually fit their needs.
No, and I'm sure that's true. And also in Chiapas in '94, yeah, 94, 95. That's when the Zapatistas were at war with the Mexican state.
Mhm.
And that, yeah, and that gave some energy to a kind of Indio, somewhat pagan coded Catholic tendency. And also, this is a really interesting subject matter to me because I deal so much in 20th century revisionism and the sort of apocalypse and zeitgeist and sociological aspects at scale of the Cold War. The degree to which in the 20th century religion was suppressed, that really can't be overstated. I mean, obviously, behind the wall in the Second World of the East Bloc and beyond, it was suppressed as a matter of law.
Yeah.
But in the West, there was this idea that, well, religion's dead. Nobody thinks that way anymore. And, human behaviors and desires and ambitions as well as pathologies is all reducible to material phenomena. And as soon as we map the brain completely, all these things will cease to be mysterious. That way of thinking is totally dead. It's really fascinating. That's why atheists are lol cows these days, because nobody thinks like that anymore. But from about 1989, when the inter-German border came down and the Second World imploded, to about the first decade of the 2000s, there was this mass resurgence of religious practice, and people who'd been kind of in this pressure cooker environment where religious observance was sort of frowned upon, some strange tendencies were curated, especially because there wasn't really an open discussion of what was doctrinally proper. And, it wasn't something people were really comfortable talking about in the open. So I think that was part of it. But also the punctuated disturbances of globalism at scale emerging and the future shock of the information age and everything else, this, identitarian things and aspects of human social life took on a profound significance. And I think people gravitated towards discreetly, sort of specifically culturally coded iterations of congregational worship practices. This is true in the Islamic world too, I might add. So yeah, I don't think you're not wrong. To be clear too, there was some very disturbing things were underway. I mean, one of the subtexts of this occult series that Jay Burden and I are in the midst of, I make the point throughout that what people now claim was the Satanic Panic, it was a real thing. There really was a resurgence of pagan aspects in the developed world. And people were doing very bad things. And demonic influences really seemed to hold sway over large sections of the population to one degree or another. There was the famous, it's kind of been memory hold, but there was this awful case in 1989. This college boy named Mark Kilroy, he was quite literally kidnapped during spring break when he was partying down in Mexico by these narco Satanists, and they tortured and murdered him and cannibalized parts of him, and they removed his brain and some of his body parts and use them in rituals to gain power. And they specifically, this guy Adolfo Costanzo, he was this narco cult leader, and he was an adept in all manner of pagan religions, and through his mother, he had connections to some Haitian witch doctor, holy man, as well as being involved in indigenous Mesoamerican pagan practices. But he targeted Kilroy specifically because he was like this tall, good-looking, like muscular blonde guy. He was like a very robust specimen, and in a very sort of Aztec way, Costanzo's notion was, if you sacrifice like a powerful man, like an attractive and powerful man, that you'll derive greater power from his energy or something. I mean, this is very sick, but people really did and do believe in that kind of stuff. And it was presented when I remember George H.W. Bush 41, he mentioned the Kilroy case in the midst of talking about the war on drugs and taking direct action against cartel elements. And I mean, back then there really was a cartel to speak of. It was very much centered in Colombia. Costanzo's gang was very much centered in border country, but that was kind of the exception. But be that as it may, Bush 41 mentioned this as an example of narco-terrorist evil. But after that, it was quickly memory hold, and people would say, well, there's nothing sinister about traditional Mesoamerican religious practice, and you're just being prejudiced if you suggest otherwise. That's really the wrong way to look at it. And I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm quite a bit more ecumenical than a lot of people. That's why I deal a lot in comparative theology and things. And some of our comrades are pagans, and I respect them. And when I'm in their house, I take their practices seriously and afford them proper respect, even though I hope they come to Jesus Christ. I don't proselytize. But be that as it may, these things aren't benign, and you can't say that the kind of stuff that somebody like Costanzo was into, or the kind of stuff that some of these street guys who worship Santa Muerte as some sort of lesser deity, you can't say that stuff is just benign, or that, and you also can't say that, well, that stuff might be sinister and inherently dangerous, but, well, that's just anomalous. It's not anomalous. A lot of people believe in this kind of stuff, and religiosity, I realize I'm rambling. I'll hand it back to you in a minute. Because religiosity, the story really of the end of the Cold War through the 21st century into today, the zeitgeist is very religiously coded. Okay, and people who don't understand that aren't in the game. You can tell the people who don't leave their house, or the people who live on Reddit, versus people who are actually engaged because the people talk about, like, oh, religion doesn't matter. They're thinking, and that's the thinking of 50 years ago. Or that's the way people think in echo chambers and, kind of midwit academe. Like, that's not the reality. The reality is of globalism is the reality, and the mass resurgence of religiosity of all sorts is really the story of the sociological and political aspect of globalism. That this is a real thing, and within that is very much a resurgence of the occult, a resurgence of atavistic practices that have been hidden in some cases for generations or centuries, is now coming back into the open and being openly embraced and encouraged by political authorities. That's one of the reasons why in Africa, you know, you had like Islam, Islamic authorities in sub-Saharan Africa. They view their primary adversaries as the pagan element, and that's not for political expediency or something, or that's not them confabulating some sort of enemy to justify their, heavy-handed dictates within the spaces they control. It's a real thing. Latin America, same thing. Although obviously there's not, there's not an Islamic cultural influence there in the way there is in Africa. But so this isn't just academic, is my point. I mean, that doesn't mean you should be paranoid, and anytime you see a Hispanic person lighting a candle with a Grim Reaper on it, or anytime you see somebody like an Eastern European person and engaged in what looks to be an idolatrous practice, that doesn't mean there's something sinister axiomatically going on there, but it does partake of a wider tendency, some of which is quite sinister and in my opinion, demonic, if that makes any sense.
I completely agree. And I don't think you're rambling at all. I think your greater point on, with the late 90s and, well, just the fall of the Soviet Union, I think one thing people forget too, and it's great that you mentioned it, with the 20th century being, really just, it's the 20th century. The most amount of change that we've ever seen happened in the span of that 100 years. And people forget that, especially after the Second World War, setting the stage for everything, at least in terms of how we view society and, giving humanity, even if humanity had forgotten God, giving humanity a Satan to look at, right? With the post-war consensus that is now starting to kind of crack up a little bit now. There was a overarching soteriology in both the first and second world, right? With Marxism especially, there is, there's that Hegelian aspect, like, hey, there is a point to history, there is an end that we're working towards. And that was informed actually by Hegel's, Christian consciousness growing up. But that was what led to Marxism being a religious force. And then you also have kind of this baptism of the institutional religions by the forces of the first world, where, I guess there's no better exemplification than, like, let's say in a Catholic context, like John Paul II, right? Catholicism being this face of anti-communism, and there's a reason why he was pretty much like the Ronald Reagan of popes. And like Reagan, I think he was also overrated, just like Reagan. Not to downplay the good he did, but
no, but
really
he was a huge media figure, and the
Exactly.
Islamic awakening was something nobody saw coming too, and that was huge. That you literally had a jihad against the communists, and thousands of young men answered the call, and you had the Islamic Revolution in Iran, the seizure of the Grand Mosque in '79. Yeah, it was. You had around the same time you had the martyrdom of Bobby Sands, which changed everything in terms of the psychological environment and with respect to the troubles in Ulster. Yeah, no, go ahead.
Yeah, there was like, with all these forces, and almost with especially with the Iranian Revolution, right? Like, almost the first real, like, anti-modern revolution, like pretty much like the antithesis to the French Revolution, right? With what happened in '79. And like, there was this push and pull, and with the competing soteriologies of the first and the second world, the first world baptizing the traditional institutions, and with the second world just offering a completely different, non, a godless alternative, but still with aspects that are very obviously of a religious nature. Once that worldwide struggle, where everyone was either, in one camp or the other, or rarely trying to find their own third way, once that was over, the floodgates, I do think, opened up.
Yeah, that's affirmative. You know, and I mean, I maintain, to your point about Marxist-Leninism being more more Hegelian than a lot of people acknowledge, even scholars of the subject matter. I'm not just talking about how, you know, early Marx was very much Hegelian in a rather conventional sense. I'm not talking about that. What I mean is that this concept of a telluric utopia, which is the literal endpoint of the dialectical process in modernity, you know, that's apocalyptic, and it's a secular soteriology. Absolutely. I mean, I maintain. I think Carl Schmitt nailed it. I think political life is conceptually theological in some basic capacity. You know, why that is depends on where you fall in the equation. I mean, the secularists among us obviously would say that there's a sociobiological and evolutionary psychological reason for such things. I mean, obviously, I don't accept that viewpoint. I think there's some truth in it, but not in terms of ultimate causes. But any any political struggle is essentially theological and sectarian, and it should be clear to people. And that's all the more reason why, you know, these things need to be controlled. That doesn't mean that looking forward to when our revolutionary ambitions are realized. That doesn't mean that within our communities we're going to be going into people's houses to make sure that they don't have like shrines to Santa Muerte under their bed or something, and arresting people for suspicion of pagan behaviors or practices. But that also means that, you know, you can't just be flippant about saying, well, you know, as long as people aren't as long as people aren't engaging in cannibalism or human sacrifice or sexually coveting their daughters or something, what does it matter? Well, it does matter, because it is a slippery slope, you know. And despite what people think and some of their historical fantasies or what have you, they wouldn't want to live in a truly pagan society. I maintain that, you know. Being I used to argue with a National Socialist friend of mine. I mean, he passed away some years back, but he was a brilliant guy, and he identified himself as a spiritual Aztec, and he wasn't just being facetious or funny. He was being serious, and we'd argue over the subject matter of human sacrifice a lot, and he was always saying, well, you know, he was always saying to me in an accusatory capacity, you know, you always cite the Maestra, and, you know, you believe in the executioner as the sole essence of sovereignty. You know, you've made the point that when properly implemented, the death penalty is a human sacrifice. So what's wrong with literal human sacrifice? And I mean, I shouldn't have to elaborately explicate what the difference is and why it's problematic, but his notion was that there's absolutely nothing wrong with literal paganism, and, you know, human sacrifice and the way that the Aztec Empire practiced it is fine. And in fact, it's better than fine. It's a positive good, because it inculcates people with this kind of sanguinary bloodlust that, you know, makes for racial warriors. And I told him that I guarantee he would not want to live in the Aztec Empire. You know, and I left it at that. But and I'm not saying that giving people leeway to pursue you know, spiritual practices of an unconventional sort is going to lead them to committing ritual homicide or worshiping Satan or something. But most people can't truly handle that kind of thing. Most people can be very corrupted by that kind of thing, even if they are strong spiritually and psychically. And, you know, it should be fairly actively discouraged without, you know, resorting to treating people like children or like coolies or something whose inner lives need to be moderated and regulated, if you follow what I mean.
I completely understand. There's definitely like a prudential way to look at at such practices. I mean, I see this a lot on the traditional Catholic side. People get really into reading about exorcisms, and of course, I mean, there's a big cultural draw to that. I think a lot of people, when they think of Catholicism, might think of kind of the church and its interactions with the preternatural, right? But there can sometimes be a tendency where people want to, blame Satan for everything. He's not under every rock and behind every door. Very real, and there is a danger there, but it's something that you need to be prudential about. And if you start throwing those very heavy accusations around willy nilly, it's not gonna be good for you or anyone else. But yeah, no, it really is like a real thing. Even if someone, you can it can seem as benign as you're aware probably of the platform Etsy, where there's like these
Yeah,
women
yeah.
they claim like now I'm laughing because it is like it's just so weird because it's like a digitally monetized thing, but you can like buy or pay these like women to like light a candle and have them hex somebody. How efficacious that is, I don't know, but
Yeah,
like I
that's incredibly weird. I knew what I know of it. I know like a lot of ladies who are into like arts and crafts like sell their stuff on there, but that's I didn't know that. Yeah, it was like I didn't know that ladies were like hexing people, but that doesn't surprise me entirely. But no, go
my
ahead.
wife sells stuff on Etsy. Now she
Right,
doesn't do
right.
any occult stuff. She sells like blankets and stuff, but
Yeah, no, the lady I knew, she was very normal and like very much into like wholesome chick stuff. Yeah, she'd like sew like stuffed animals and sweaters and things. Like, yeah, I didn't realize there was this other aspect to it. But again, it doesn't totally surprise me.
yeah, it's just we're in this weird like interlaced world of the digital and with these like yeah, as you mentioned, atavistic. That's a great descriptor. These movements coming back almost in like a perennial fashion when the conditions are right, when there's like that amount of chaos where they can kind of brew and maybe there's a lack of direction for a lot of people. Um, and one interesting too, as you mentioned, with kind of the chaos of the 20th century, but also you mentioned the religious oppression aspect. Now, Mexico, a lot of people might not think, oh, they think Mexico, very Catholic country, very Catholic area. Well, in the 20s and 30s, there also was religious persecution of, practicing Catholics with the Cristero Wars and some of the smaller skirmishes that happened later in like the early 40s that they called La Segunda. And like that's kind of a part of Mexican history that is usually just kind of tied into the greater revolutionary period of the early 20th century for them. But I think that had a much bigger impact on the practice of Mexican Catholicism than I think a lot of authors give it credit for. It's frankly, uh, it hasn't there hasn't been a lot of literature out about it, but the 90s was when the Catholic Church in Mexico had a resurgence again. But once again, this was also coming in at this kind of chaotic time with globalism. You mentioned, the Matamoros, murders that happened there, but even as like late as 2012, in Tijuana, TJ, right across the border from San Diego, there was a series of explicitly Santa Muerte, like worshiping gang members that killed children and literally like sacrificed them ritually to Santa Muerte
No,
specifically.
it's yeah, it's horrific stuff. Well, I maintain too, and it's difficult to kind of dig through the noise and disinformation of regime media, but something that's not when they talk about the femicide in the borderlands, that's not some lurid feminist fantasy that's really happening. The young women just turn up dead. And specifically what I'm referring to is this patch of kind of lawless borderland has become something of a dumping ground for these poor young women victims. And it's pretty clear to me there's a ritualistic aspect there. This isn't just pimps, murdering their charges, or sexual slavery in its most depraved iteration. I mean, there might be an aspect of that, but that's not the primary catalyst. It's been pretty clear to me from jump that this is very much related to occult practices, and these poor women are being murdered incident to those belief systems. So yeah, it's a very real thing. It's very much alive and well, and they're killing people.
Yeah. I mean, it's crazy to think like we're now in this period where like organized religion, I think people that are on the rolls for a traditional church or denomination, right? That's kind of gone down, but belief in I guess religious ideas, spirituality, and belief in a higher power have also gone up, like adversely. I mean, anecdotally, I've heard many more people being like, "Yeah, I definitely believe. I just don't want to subscribe to any established teaching." Um, do you think that's kind of ties into why? Because a lot of the reporting on this was coming out like around 2017. A lot of the academic research that was being put into Santa Muerte, and at the time they were describing it as one of the fastest growing new religious movements in the United States and perhaps even the Western Hemisphere. Uh, I don't know. Do you have any insight, I guess, from just your experiences being in Chicago and just being very active in our space? Like, I've seen more and more people turn to religion. How that
No,
manifests, yeah,
like I said, the story of the 21st century in apocalyptic terms begins the night of November 9th, 1989. And that the defining aspect, more than any other, of that epoch that we are in right now is the resurgence of religiosity. Okay, I mean that's why, like I said, people aren't in the game who are still parroting this dead 20th century mantra that religion is no longer as an animating force in people's lives. The the norm now is for people to harbor religious beliefs, conventional or not. And if you're some self-identified atheist or whatever, you're an NPC who's not really engaged with the spirit of the age. So yeah, definitely.
yeah. I think that's a really good capstone to kind of the topic. It seems like, although Nietzsche, famously claimed God is dead, with the destruction of the Iron Curtain, the end of that epoch, religion showed that it still was alive and well, and whether traditional or in new forms or maybe old forms that found new context, is rearing its head once again. Hopefully, mostly for the better, but as in some of these extreme cases, as we've seen and discussed, sometimes for worse. But Thomas, thank you so much for coming on. We're right about the hour mark. This has been an amazing discussion. Thank you for your insight, and don't ever think you're rambling. I'm listening, and I'm just like, this is amazing. So,
No, you're
and
welcome. Thank you for the
yeah,
kind words. Yeah, no, I'm a little bit tired today, so I didn't. And like I said, I I don't like riffing off of a script unless it's a historical conversation or something that requires reference to data points and as the primary emphasis. So yeah, I just want to make sure I'm expressing myself coherently. But yeah, thank you, man. This was great.
well, I think maybe we're on equal footing because I also got this cold, so I'm also not feeling 100%, but feeling pretty good right now because that was a lot of fun. Please tell my audience where they can find you, what some projects you're working on currently, and maybe some stuff you have in the works.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, this past summer, I dedicated myself to working on this manuscript, and it'll be fit for publication, I'm hoping, by November. So that's what I got in the works right now. I mean, I'm always recording and podcasting and things like that, both on my own platforms and on other people's, like your own. I appreciate you guys availing your platforms to me. The best place to find my work product, you can go to my website. It's Thomas777.com. It's number 7, HOMAS 777.com. That's where you can find my Instagram and my Substack and stuff. My Substack is my primary online home. That's why, my podcast is there, and a bunch of my longer form writing and, other stuff like that. It's realthomas777.substack.com. Hit up my Substack and or my website, and you'll be able to find everywhere I'm active online.
Awesome. And as another note, as I mentioned before during the episode, check out his series with Jay Burden. Frequent guest on there, but if you're interested in kind of our line of discussion tonight, there's a lot of I think most of the recent episodes where you were on his show are about similar topics and themes as to what we discussed tonight. So if you want to hear more, go check out Mr. Burden. He's a great friend of the channel and of Thomas. So Thomas, once again, thank you so much for coming on. I had a great time. Made my day, frankly, because I've been feeling so under the weather. And thank you, man. This is awesome.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you, buddy.
How would you like me? Abortion's really gay.